Holy Diver, released in 1983, and its follow-up, The Last in Line, released in 1984, are arguably two of the finest metal albums ever made, and they're definitely in my top 10 list of the greatest metal albums of all time. I grew up listening to both of these albums, especially Holy Diver, but in later years I've discovered that The Last in Line is really just as consistent as its predecessor. Therefore, I thought it would be fun to go through the track lists of both of these albums and compare the songs to each other, and in the end I will determine which album is my favorite. Thankfully, both of these albums contain 9 tracks, so it will be easy to put them face to face, and with that being said, let's get into it. We're starting off with the opening tracks on both of these records, and both of them are absolute classics. On Holy Diver we got Stand Up and Shout, and on The Last in Line we got We Rock. And both of them are these very speedy opening tracks that really gets your attention, and that's something Dio really likes to do. It's the same if you look at, for example, Sacred Heart and Dream Evil, which were his other solo records after these two. Although both of these tracks got that kind of anthem feeling, I believe that The Last in Line takes this point here, and I think We Rock is actually a way stronger track than Stand Up and Shout, and in my opinion it's the best opening track on any Dio album in his solo career. I think the opening riff of We Rock is a little bit more interesting, and I also think that the lead guitar work by Vivian Campbell here is even better than on Holy Diver. Also, I think Dio wrote better lyrics for this song compared to Holy Diver's opening track, and therefore it's my favorite. So, let's go on to the next one. Once again, two absolute titans have to face off for this point, because both of these albums' title tracks are actually the second track. So Holy Diver houses Holy Diver, and The Last in Line has The Last in Line. Although it pains me to compare these two songs, I have to give the point to Holy Diver, because I feel like Dio took all his experience that he had gained from working with these big bands such as Rainbow and Black Sabbath, and he just channeled that into a song that is basically perfect, and it's still such an icon. The opening riff is so classic, and it's a little bit slower, but it's so atmospheric, and I think he leans a little bit into that darker side, which I really appreciate, with the lyrics that are pretty haunting. Although this point goes to Holy Diver, I can't understate how much I like The Last in Line's title track, with that acoustic opening and that We Are Coming Home scream like 50 seconds into the song. I think it's one of his greatest tracks ever. If The Last in Line had been released before Holy Diver, I would probably be sitting here saying that The Last in Line had the superior title track, so really it's all about timing, and I think that The Last in Line musically is just as impressive as Holy Diver. But with that being said, the point goes to Holy Diver. Next up on the list is the third track, which is Gypsy from Holy Diver and Breathless from The Last in Line. And for me, this point will go to The Last in Line's Breathless, which I think is a better song than Gypsy. I think Breathless is a little bit more of a heavy song in the riffing department, which I do really appreciate, although I find the Gypsy to be a very catchy tune. But I do find the lyrics on that song a little bit ridiculous, with riding on the gypsy being the chorus. So for me, this point has to go to The Last in Line. Next up is Caught in the Middle from Holy Diver, that's facing off with I Speed at Night from The Last in Line, and once again this point has to go to Holy Diver for me. This might actually be the hardest decision in the video for me, because I think that I Speed at Night is a genius track, and I think the placement is also pretty genius, because it sort of breaks up that little bit slower tempo that had been going for the last two tracks on The Last in Line. With that being said, Caught in the Middle is just an absolute classic, and I think Dio's vocals really shine on this track, although they always do, but I have to give this point to Holy Diver after all. Although many days I'd probably prefer I Speed at Night, I just have to go with Holy Diver because it's such a classic tune. Finally, we're back to a decision that I find a little bit easier, with Holy Diver's fifth track being Don't Talk to Strangers and The Last in Line's fifth track being One Night in the City. Although I find both of these tracks great, as always, this point will go to Holy Diver and Don't Talk to Strangers. I absolutely adore One Night in the City, but Don't Talk to Strangers is probably my second favorite track of Holy Diver and one of my absolute favorite Dio tracks. Once again, a very haunting track with that acoustic opening, and I think lyrically Dio is spot on with this track. This track is just truly iconic, and it's unfortunate for One Night in the City that it's going up against this song, because nothing can really beat it in my opinion. So point goes to Holy Diver, and let's get on to the next one. Next up is track number 6, and we got Straight Through the Heart from Holy Diver and Evil Eyes from The Last in Line, and for me this point once again has to go to Holy Diver. Although I still absolutely love Evil Eyes, I actually believe it's one of the weaker tracks on The Last in Line, which may be surprising because I've seen a lot of people say it's one of their favorites. But for me, Holy Diver takes the cake here because it's just such a classy track and I can never go wrong with it. Now we're off to the 7th track, and on Holy Diver that would be Invisible, and on The Last in Line it would be Mystery. And I find Mystery to be the superior track here, and The Last in Line will take this point. Invisible is one of those tracks that I haven't really listened to a lot, but it has grown on me over time, whereas Mystery is really one of those that just hits you instantly. And although it's a little bit of a softer one with some keyboards, I actually love it, and it's one of my favorite tracks on The Last in Line. Once again, it's one of those softer Dio songs that he just does absolutely perfect in my opinion, and the point will go to The Last in Line, and let's move on to the next one. It's time for the 8th track, which on Holy Diver is the iconic Rainbow in the Dark, and on The Last in Line it is Eat Your Heart Out. This point will go to Holy Diver's Rainbow in the Dark, and it is like the previously mentioned track Mystery from The Last in Line, one of those softer Dio tracks that he just does really well, although he has stated that he did not appreciate the track himself and he thought it was way too poppy. The story behind the track is also incredible, and you'll have to fact check me on this, but I believe it was mentioned in a documentary that their keyboardist Claude Schnell was smoking a cigarette, and he wrote that iconic keyboard line before any ash had time to fall down from the cigarette, which is a pretty badass story. I will say, however, that this is one of the other cases where a track overshadows another one, and I really think that Eat Your Heart Out is one of the best tracks once again on The Last in Line, and I believe that the last 3 tracks on that album are absolutely iconic and some of the best songs that Dio have made. But just because it's such an iconic track, it has to go to Holy Diver, so let's go on to the last one. The last track on Holy Diver is Shame on the Night, and the last track on The Last in Line would be Egypt, The Chains Are On, and for me, the last point has to go to The Last in Line. I do really like Shame on the Night, and I think the lyrics are very cool, with Dio thinking that the night should be ashamed because it gave him dreams and it will never tell him what those dreams meant, which I think is a pretty cool lyric. But for me, Egypt, The Chains Are On is just a clear winner here. Just like the title track on Iron Maiden's Power Slave that came out the same year in 1984, it's one of those mystic Egypt songs with a very eerie melody that I find very interesting, and it's one of the darker tracks that is done on that album, definitely. I absolutely adore this style though, and for me this might be my favorite closing track of any Dio album of all time, which is pretty heavy, I must say. This leaves us with a final scoreline of 5 points for Holy Diver and 4 points for The Last in Line, which is pretty ironic because nowadays I actually prefer to listen to The Last in Line over Holy Diver. This might be because I've listened to Holy Diver so much that it's not as fun as it was when I started listening to it, and if I had to do a ranking of the Dio discography, it would probably be the second after Last in Line, which once again is pretty funny. With that being said, many of these tracks are very close to each other and at times interchangeable, and my last note would probably be that The Last in Line is a little bit more consistent than Holy Diver, although Holy Diver has a little bit higher peaks. If you'd like me to do a face-off between 2 other albums, or maybe rank a discography or something similar, then please leave a comment, and as always, thank you for watching.